Thank you. Welcome once again for our last session together. Before I speak about tonight's woman, I want to make a correction. I misspoke last week. I said that Glickl and Chaim Hamel were married when Glickl was 12 and that she had her first child at 14. She actually was betrothed at 12, married at 14, and then some time later had the child. Tonight, we're going to speak about Sarah Rivkah Rahel Leah Horowitz, who was known to her friends as Leah Horvitz. She lived in southeastern, what was then Poland, today is Western Ukraine, in the region of what was then Lviv in Polish, today Lviv, of course. We know something about Leah Horowitz from the memoirs of Dov Ber of Bolechov, a Jewish wine merchant who lived in the 18th century and wrote his memoirs toward the end of the century. He lived in Bolechov, where Leah Horowitz's father and then brother were in succession the rabbi. And Dov Ber tells us that when he was 12 years old, that is in 1735, he would go every Shabbat afternoon to the rabbi's house. And the rabbi would show him a section of the Talmud and say, you should prepare this. I'm going to take my nap, and when I wake up, I'll test you. Well, Dov says he really didn't know how to study Talmud, but lucky for him, the rabbi's sister, that is Leah Horvitz, was sitting there, and she would teach him the Gemara with the commentaries. And he says that he learned a lot from her. And she was a very learned woman, so much so that she was legendary. Into the 19th century, people talked about her scholarship, her being more learned than virtually any other woman. She was born probably sometime in the second decade of the 18th century, and she lived sometime towards the end of the century. Our main source for knowledge about Leah Horowitz is an 8-page booklet that she wrote. And you see the first page on the screen. This is a unique booklet. First of all, it is written in 3 languages. There is an introduction in Hebrew. There is a Yiddish techina. Techina is a supplicatory prayer that is said usually on certain occasions, before lighting candles, when going to the cemetery, when traveling, when someone is sick, etc. Many tchinot were designed to be recited by women, and in the 18th century, we have a trend of tchinot for women in Yiddish to be said in the synagogue during the liturgy. And I guess I should really say tchinas rather than tchinot, because these are Yiddish prayers. So Leah wrote a Yiddish techina, which was to be said in the synagogue on the Shabbat Mevarchin, the Shabbat before the new month, the Rosh Chodesh, the new month that would be coming up. But she also attached to this an Aramaic piyut. So we have Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish. Aramaic was rather unusual for anyone to write in the 18th century. And here was a woman writing a piyut, a religious poem in Aramaic with the Yiddish techina. Leah was an older contemporary of the famous Mary Wollstonecraft, the English author of A Vindication of Women's Rights, often referred to as the mother of feminism. And Leah and Mary have much in common. We don't have time to discuss that now. But one thing that they certainly had in common, Leah says that she is writing in her introduction that surely the legitimacy of women's prayer in the synagogue does not escape any clear-eyed person. And I will not speak to dullards. Well, this is something that Mary Wollstonecraft also said. She is speaking to rational people, people who are susceptible to rational arguments, that is, men. And that's what Leah wants to do. She wants to convince men of something, especially rabbis. And that's to whom her Hebrew introduction was addressed. An interesting aspect of Leah's writing is that it is an illustration of the famous theory of Leo Strauss in his book, The Persecution of the Art of Writing, a book, as you see, translated into many languages. One of the important parts of that book is a statement about esoteric writing. He calls esoteric writing the people who are afraid of persecution, afraid that their writing will not be accepted, engage in esoteric writing. What is esoteric writing? Strauss says, esoteric writing is the gradual replacement of the accepted opinions by the truth or an approximation to the truth. The replacement of the accepted opinions could not be gradual if it were not accompanied by a provisional acceptance of the accepted opinions. So the writer has to appear, at least, to be endorsing conventional wisdom and at the same time sneaking in what the writer views to be the truth. In addition, esoteric writing is the replacement of the accepted opinions, or rather, he says, the replacement of the accepted opinions could not be gradual if it were not accompanied by the suggestion of opinions which, while pointing to the truth, do not flagrantly contradict the accepted opinions. So the writer, in stating the truth or approximations of the truth, does it in a subtle, gentle way, not to appear to be flagrantly contradicting conventional wisdom. And this, I think, describes Leah Horowitz's writing, as we can see. In the Aramaic piyut, in one passage, she says, toward the end, we pray to you, that is, to God, a prayer that you will grant us and to all the sages of the scholarly fellowship, male children, scholars of Torah, like Moses, Moshe, the faithful shepherd. And in Aramaic, benin duchrin, she prays specifically for male children. Male children are preferred, and they should be scholars, that is, of course, male scholars. But what does she say in Yiddish? In the parallel passage in the Yiddish, Leah wrote, we call you, our beloved Father, and ask that you grant us and all who apply themselves to your holy Torah, not necessarily sages, not necessarily rabbis, not necessarily men, that we should merit having proper and healthy, not sons necessarily, but offspring, zera kasher chayim v'kayamim, zera, offspring, seed, which can be either male or female. So she is subtly saying in Yiddish, which is being read by women, of course, that what we're praying for is not just boys who will become scholars. We also want girls who can apply themselves to Torah. And this message continues in her booklet. Leah is very familiar with the stereotypes about women in her age, and again, she appears to accept these stereotypes, to endorse these stereotypes. For example, she notes women are talkative, gossiping in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Women cry as opposed to men. Women, rather than praying in the synagogue, arouse jealousy, even in such an awesome place. When she gets home, a woman argues with her husband over finery. She says, in the synagogue, I should be outfitted as beautifully as so-and-so. Now this is a trope. This is a common stereotype the Vilna Gaon, in his famous letter to his wife, advised that his daughters should not go to synagogue, and one of the reasons why they shouldn't is because of this, that they would see women being jealous of each other because of their clothing or their jewelry or their ostentatious belongings. So Leah presents these stereotypes as if to say, this is what women are like. And here we have a rare painting from 1781 of Rivkah and Elia Lvovsky, two, as you can see, affluent Jewish women of the 18th century. This portrait was commissioned by the King of Poland at the time, Stanisław August Poniatowski. And you can see what the Vilna Gaon and Leah were talking about finery that women might wear in the synagogue if they could afford it. And then Leah slips in something somewhat unusual. She says that Rav Acha says in Yalkut Shimoni of the book of Ruth, it is only by the merit of women that the generations are redeemed. Rav Acha said, it's only by the merit of women that the generations are redeemed. And Leah says, this is surprising. Placing the permanent residents, that is, in Aramaic, the Yitziva, the citizens, the men, down on the ground, and the strangers, Giora, that is the women, in the highest heaven. How can this be that women are the ones who bring the redemption? After all, in the Talmud it says that in his own home, even a weaver is a satrap. A man's home is his castle. A man is a king in his home. And a proper woman obeys her husband. So what is Rav Acha talking about? Well, Leah uses this as a hook to subvert the conventional wisdom, to subvert the stereotypes, the things that she appeared to endorse. She uses this saying, it is only by the merit of women that the generations are redeemed, as a means to challenge, to reconsider women's status and role in Judaism. Now, as we saw in previous lectures, she had a lot to fight against. I will remind you of the classic statement in Masechet Brachot, how do women gain merit? By bringing their sons to the synagogue to learn Torah, and by sending their husbands to the study hall and waiting for them until they come from the study hall. That is, women's job culturally is to facilitate the cultural achievements of their menfolk. And as we just saw Leah quote in the Yalkut Shimoni Shoftim, it says, a proper woman obeys her husband. And one of the most famous rabbis in Poland, Shlomo Ephraim Lunchitz, states, it is well known that the male is obligated to perform many mitzvot, not true of females, who are exempt from most mitzvot. Now we know this is a misstatement. As we've said before, the convention is that women are exempt from 14 positive commandments. That's it. Yet, Rabbi Lunchitz, a very important rabbi, could hyperbolize and say that women are exempt from most mitzvot. So this is what Leah is up against. So what does Leah say? Well, in all matters of this world, olam hazeh, a man should act manly and be a man. Even a lowly weaver is a satrap in his own house. But in matters of the world to come, women should prevail over their husbands. And she has a long discussion of how she comes to this. We don't have time to get into the details now of her exegesis. But when we're talking about matters of eternity, women should prevail over their husbands. So therefore, if a husband wants to neglect Torah study or have his sons neglect Torah study, then blessed is the wife who prevails over him and brings her sons to the synagogue and waits for her husband to come from the Beit Midrash. So that famous saying in Masechet Brachot, she turns it to mean that women are not just facilitators. Women are leaders. Women have to lead their menfolk to the Torah. And then there's the subject of what do women have to know? In the Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim, the Ramah, the Moshe Israelis, and we've met before in these lectures, states, optionally, women may form a grace quorum, in Hebrew mizuman, for themselves. But when they eat with men, they are obligated and they fulfill their obligation through our quorum, even though they do not understand. So we're talking now here about Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals. And what the Ramah says is that if there are at least 3 women over the age of 12, they may, if they want, form a mizuman, say the introductory lines to the Birkat Hamazon. And if they are eating with men, they are obliged to join the men's quorum, the men's mizuman. That means to answer the men. But there are some interesting aspects here. Number one, this is clearly the boys against the girls. As is true of the entire Shulchan Aruch. The Ramah and Yosef Karo, the Machaber, are addressing men. It is our quorum, that is, the women are joining us. This is not addressed to men and women, it's addressed to the men. But more pertinent to our topic tonight, he says that they should join the men's mizuman even though they do not understand. If they do not understand the Birkat Hamazon, they still are joining in. This goes back to the Talmud, the discussion of the Megillah, where it's stated that even someone who doesn't understand Hebrew and unlearned men, ignoramus men, and women who don't understand still have to listen to the Megillah in Hebrew, and they fulfill their obligation by listening even though they do not understand. So there is a thread in Jewish tradition that women don't have to understand. In the Middle Ages, Rashi and others say, no, they do have to understand. And this is what Leah runs with. Leah wants to claim women are entitled to engage in Torah, to learn Torah. So she says, in the beginning of her introduction, don't be surprised that a woman is dealing in Torah discourse. Even though it is not often that a woman engages in Torah discourse, the crown of Torah is set out for all the inhabitants of the world. Keter Torah munach lechol ba'ei olam, and that includes women. Moreover, as in the spirit of what Rashi and others said in the Middle Ages, on Shabbat, they should speak words of Torah and study, each according to his ability. Moreover, those men incapable of study and women should read in Yiddish, so they also will understand how to serve God. They must know how to keep the mitzvot that apply to them, that God has set forth. as we mentioned earlier in these lectures, in this period, the early modern period, 16th, 17th, 18th century, there is an entire library that develops in Yiddish, much of it accessible to women. So women, as I mentioned in the previous lecture, while boys and men study, women read. That is, women read in Yiddish many texts that provide parallel knowledge to what a boy or a man will learn from the canonic texts. So women should study Torah. Next, she says, women's participation in public prayer is legitimate, not just legitimate, but it is essential. And she has proof for this. There is proof that women's prayer is for the sake of heaven and brings blessing upon them. In the Torah it says, in the book of Shemot, Exodus, chapter 38, verse 8, God commanded the fashioning of the basin, the kior, for the Mishkan, the tabernacle, from the mirrors of those assembled at the entrance to the tent of meeting, to the Ohel Moed. From the mirrors of those assembled, the words in Hebrew are marot hatzovot, the mirrors of those assembled. The most common explanation of the mirrors of those assembled is that the women who had been enslaved in Egypt and came out of Egypt assembled around the Ohel Moed to donate their mirrors, which were from bronze or copper, to be fashioned into the kior. What was special about these mirrors? These mirrors were used by those women when they were enslaved in Egypt to beautify themselves at the end of a hard day's work, to make themselves attractive, so that their husbands, who even though they had engaged in back-breaking work all day long, as had the women themselves, would still be aroused and want to have children, want to make children. So these mirrors were instrumental in assuring the future of the Israelite people. So they had a kind of aura of holiness about them. And that is the explanation that Rashi gives and that many others give. However, the Onkelos and the Ibn Ezra say that these mirrors were donated by women who assembled outside the Mishkan. What were they doing? They were praying, if you will, davening. These women were praying every day. And the mirrors that they gave were mirrors that they didn't need anymore, because these were women who either were old and therefore not interested in sex, or for whatever reason, they no longer had libido. Well, Leah adopts this interpretation, but she gives it a spin. Those assembled were the women who would sit in the Beit Midrash all day praying. That's what Leah says. She doesn't say anything about them having no libido or being old. Any aged women, any women in any kind of physical state were among those who were praying all day outside of the Mishkan. So if women were praying outside of the Mishkan in the desert in the time of Moshe and Aharon, well, certainly they should be praying in synagogues in our time. Another proof that she brings. The verse states, that is in the book of Yirmiyahu, Jeremiah, chapter 31, Jeremiah says, when God gathers Israel from the ends of the earth, they shall come with weeping. So that means the redemption will happen with crying. It requires crying. Well, remember that stereotype. Who cries better than women? We need women in the synagogue to cry. Without women crying in the synagogue, even if they don't know Hebrew, even if they can't read the prayers, if they simply cry, they have a function. And Leah says women should be in the synagogue morning and night for Shacharit, Mincha, and Ma'ariv. As she says, however, a person's prayer is only heard in the synagogue. Prayer is preferable in the synagogue. Therefore, since the day of the Lord is near, that is, we believe that redemption is nigh, it is proper that our women come to the synagogue morning and evening to pray with copious tears. So women belong in shul. Moreover, Leah says in her introduction to her imagined audience of rabbis, don't criticize me for what I'm doing. By composing this techina, I believe I am benefiting the public. You complain, you rabbis, that women are talkative, gossiping in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Remember the stereotype we mentioned before. Well, I'm giving them something to say. If they're just sitting there doing nothing, of course they're going to talk and gossip. Don't criticize me. I'm giving them a prayer that they can actually say in the synagogue instead of gossiping. Finally, Leah makes a third claim. In addition to asserting that women should study Torah, women should participate in public prayer, the third thing is that women are not only facilitators. Once again, I direct your attention to the famous quote from the Talmud that women's job is to facilitate their menfolk's cultural achievements. Leah does not agree. Leah wants to prove that women have a full religious life, that their religious obligations are only somewhat less than those of men. Once again, I remind you, women conventionally are exempt from positive commandments that are to be done at a certain time, that are time-bound, such as wearing tzitzit, putting on tefillin, sitting in the sukkah, counting the omer, etc. Of course, many of these they can take on voluntarily, but we won't get into that now. I've also mentioned previously in these lectures that there are 3 mitzvot that traditionally are considered women's special mitzvot. That is mitzvot chana, separating, challah, separating a portion of the dough when baking, everything that has to do with menstruation, nidah, and hadlakat nerot, lighting candles Friday night. Leah doesn't accept this. She implies anyway that she doesn't like the idea that women are only identified with 3 mitzvot. Women have many, many more mitzvot. What does she say? There are positive commandments and negative commandments. Mitzvot aseh, mitzvot lo ta'aseh. There are 365 mitzvot lo ta'aseh, according to the Rambam's count. Well, the Talmud says you get just as much reward for observing a lotasif, a negative commandment for refraining from doing something prohibited, as you get for doing something that is mandated. And women have to observe all 365 negative commandments, just like men. Now, let's talk about positive commandments. Originally, in the Torah, according to the Rambam, there are 248 positive commandments, things that you are supposed to do as opposed to not do. Honor your parents, observe Shabbat. Those are positive commandments, as opposed to don't kill, don't steal. Those are negative commandments. However, the Rambam, Maimonides, says that Bazman hazeh, since the temple was destroyed, of the 248 positive commandments, only 60 apply to individual people, because many applied to the service in the temple, and many apply to the general public. Only 60 apply to individual people. So, there are not really, practically speaking, there are not 613 mitzvot. There are 425 mitzvot, 365 negative commandments, and 60 positive commandments. So there are 425 mitzvot that men must observe. That's the full complement of mitzvot. Well, what about women? As we just said, women have 365 negative commandments, and they are exempt from 14 positive commandments. So that means women have, in theory at least, 411 commandments. Well, men have 425, women have 411, in addition to which women can voluntarily adopt some of those commandments that they are exempt from. So, women have a full complement of religious obligations that is not really very inferior to that of men. So women have a full religious life, not just as facilitators, but as actors. So Leah was advocating an increase in Jewish women's cultural capital, which is why I titled this lecture, The Jewish Cultural Capitalist. She was trying to convince her audience, which was rabbis, that women should have a participatory stance in Judaism and not a facilitative stance. How much did she succeed? Well, she failed. If we take this booklet, Techina Imahos, that she wrote, it was reprinted many times. But it was only printed twice that we know of anyway, with the Hebrew introduction in which she made most of her claims to the rabbis. The Yiddish Techina, to be said in the synagogue, was reprinted several times. But the introduction, where she challenged the status quo, that was only printed, as far as we know, twice. And the first time, it was published by a woman, Yehudit Rosanes, who ran a printing house in Lviv from 1788 until the early 19th century. So it took a woman to publish this, shall I say, daring or challenging introduction. So in her time, Leah, on the one hand, had a very positive reputation, which lasted, as I said before, into the 19th century, as a learned woman. However, no one was willing to accept her ideas then. It took more than 200 years for Leah's ideas of women having a greater portion of Jewish cultural achievement to take hold, both participating in the synagogue, as we just saw reading the Torah, and in our time, women studying Torah, which has become more and more accepted. So while she failed in her time, she raised the issue that gained more and more momentum as time went on. So if we summarize what Leah was advocating, women require formal education. Women can apprehend the same knowledge as men. Women should study Torah in Yiddish. Women are disposed to act rationally, to be partners, and attain maximum virtue. Women should participate in public worship and observe the full complement of mitzvot. In marriage, a woman should be a partner. In matters of the world to come, women should prevail over their husbands. And I dare say that Mary Wollstonecraft would agree with each of these points. Well, we have come to the end of our series, and I want to summarize some of the things that I think come out of the lectures that I've tried to convey. The four women that we've discussed: Bela Falk, who was born in the 16th century and lived into the 17th, Githel Koshechovsky, who lived through most of the 17th century, Glickel Hamel, who was born in the mid-17th and lived until 1724, and Leah Horvitz, who was born sometime in the 17 teens and lived probably into the 1780s or 90s. What do they have in common? First of all, these women were not radicals. They were all traditional. They were observant. They were conventional in many ways. They would have been horrified by the idea of changing Jewish tradition, changing halakha, violating social norms, violating religious norms. None of them were radical. Each of them found a way to pave a new path, a non-traditional path, within the bounds of tradition. Secondly, all of them were resistant to gaslighting. What is gaslighting? Gaslighting refers to the manipulation of often women to make them think that they don't have the proper background, that they don't really know anything, that they are imposters. Another term for it might be mansplaining, where men say to women, well, you really don't understand this, let me explain it to you. I dare say that none of the four women that we've discussed would have stood for gaslighting or mansplaining. Each of them had very clear opinions, and each of them make it clear that they told their menfolk what their opinions were, and even if they met with opposition. Bela, with her ideas about halakha, which we saw that not all authorities were willing to accept, but she was very firm in her ideas. Githel while her husband was alive, was certainly a full partner, and she was the head of the family, the head of the business. Glickle makes it very clear that her husband respected her and her ideas, and she was very active in the management of the business while he was alive, and certainly after he died. And she also was the head of her family in every way. And Leah, who is perhaps the most daring in challenging rabbis outright to increase women's cultural capital. So all four of these women had what we call today agency. They were entrepreneurs, some in business, some in religion, but each of them initiated. They did not just react. And each of them transcends stereotypes. Each of them, at first glance, might conform to a stereotype. Bela seems like the ideal, selfless Jewish wife and mother, but in closer inspection, we see that she certainly had a mind of her own and made her own mark in her way. Gittel was a woman who would not countenance anyone dismissing her or treating her lightly. Glickle was very much the same, and she, as I tried to claim last week, makes a case for women even being superior. And then, of course, Leah, who says women deserve a much greater role in Judaism. So these are our four women of consequence. I hope that they hold some significance for you in some way. And now we're open to questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Rosman. So we have a question from Dov who wants to know, how does the esoteric writing fit in? He's referring to our last woman, obviously.
What do you mean, how does it fit in?
I'm not sure. So maybe we'll move to another question, Dov, if you want to explain.
The esoteric writing is she appears to accept conventional ideas, to endorse conventional ideas, but then she subtly subverts them. So I gave a few examples that she, in Aramaic, says male children are preferred. In Yiddish, she doesn't say that. That's esoteric writing. So she's subtly telling her Yiddish readers, well, we don't have to have boys. Another thing that she does, she emphasizes the matriarchs as opposed to the patriarchs. She says in her prayers that redemption should come by virtue of what God promised the matriarchs, not just the patriarchs. She also talks about the Shekhinah as being what's important, as the mother of the Jewish people. The Shekhinah as the female aspect of God as being the mother of the Jewish people. And another thing she does, which is very rare, she talks about the people of Israel as being not B'nai Avraham, but Bat Avraham, the daughter of Abraham. So on all of these subtle ways, she is trying to promote the centrality of women in Jewish life. And this is all, I think, a kind of esoteric writing.
All right. And Deliborka is asking whether you can repeat the name of the title of the book Leah had written.
It's a booklet, an 8-page booklet. It's called Techina Imahos. Techina Imahos. In Hebrew, I would say Techina Imahot. Techina Imahos.
Can it be found anywhere for people who are interested in closer inspection of it?
Okay, so it exists in 2 copies in the world, one in the National Library of Israel, and one in the Jewish Theological Seminary in New York. Those are the only two original copies. In volume 33 of the periodical Polin, P-O-L-I-N, I published a facsimile of the first edition, the first printing. So if you want to see the original, you can see it there. In my book, Categorically Jewish, Distinctly Polish, I have a chapter devoted to Leah and to the booklet with an annotated translation into English of the entire booklet, of the whole 8-page booklet, all three parts, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish. So you can read it in the book, Categorically Jewish.
I'll put the link to the book in a moment, because I know I'll put the link to the book. Just a moment, everyone. Ilana wants to know if there are any followers of Leah's ideas in Israel or in the diaspora today.
I'm not aware of a Leah Horowitz fan club. However, she was unknown from the, let's say, the mid-19th century until the mid-20th century. In 1961, Chaim Lieberman, the Chabad bibliograph, published an article, a small article, about her and Tchina Imahos. It didn't have much resonance, but Chava, what's Chava's last name?
Turniansky?
No, not Chava Turniansky,
No?
The other Chava. Voices of the Matriarchs. She published the book Voices of the Matriarchs, which was a study of Techinas, of Techina prayers, where she showed that by reading the Techina prayers, we can delve into the mentalite of early modern Ashkenazic Jewish women. And she devoted a chapter to Leah Horvitz, and that really brought Leah back into the public discourse.
Chava Weissler.
Chava Weissler, thank you.
Okay. Joyce wants to know if you think that these particular women are remembered and preserved because they were wealthy, or did they have different kind of support from their family?
Well, as I think I said last time, before the digital age, if you wanted to have eternal life, you should write something or have something written about you. In each of these cases, Bela, her son, wrote the extensive encomium in honor of his mother, so that's why we know about her. In the case of Gittel Choshekovsky, she is mentioned prominently in her husband's will, so that's why we know about her. Although I assume you can find out more in the archives about her and her husband. Glickel is the classic case of writing her memoirs, and thanks to her grandson copying them, and then Kaufman publishing them, so that's what we know about her. And Leah, we know about her because she wrote this booklet and because of Dov Beer's mention of her, as well as the legendary mentions of her here and there. So I would say it's not just because they're rich. Bela was not rich. Leah was not rich. It's not that they were rich. It's that they either wrote themselves or somebody wrote about them. That's why we know about them.